I'm Wayne Caldwell. I've been told that I need to project to the audience. I'm normally soft-spoken, so if I'm not yelling enough for you, please let me know. Throw something at me or whatever. I'm just tickled to death to be here with my friend Terry Roberts, who's My Mistress' Eyes Are Raven Black is new. I sat down and read this thing basically in one sitting. It was just mesmerizing to me. And I think, Terry, I think you've hit pretty much of a home run here with this.
Well, thank you very much. The thing that I will say is I'm equally tickled to death. I don't know if that's the right way to say that. But anyway, I'm tickled to be in conversation with Wayne, and we've been sort of holding up each other's books. But if you haven't gotten Wayne's collection of poetry, Woodsmoke, do yourself a favor. Track that thing down. Pay real money for it. It's worth every penny. And also, I'll say that there are a few friends, close friends and family members who are in the room with us tonight. And I want to, you don't get to hug everybody, right? In this day and age. So imagine a big virtual mosh pit. And that's sort of Malaprops tonight. So for better or worse, there we go. Exactly.
Well, we're supposed to be in conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure what that means. But I have written down, I don't know, 8 or 10 questions here that I think, I know you well enough to know that if I ask you one, you can go on for 40 minutes about it. So we may not get to all of these, but I'm going to start with this one.
All right.
People have asked over the years, where did the spirit of Thomas Wolfe go in American literature? And I think the consensus has been, until Pat Conroy died, that's where it went.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to nominate Terry as the heir apparent to that and see if he has any comments to make about his relationship with Thomas Wolfe.
That is completely out of the blue. Not only did we not rehearse this, I can't read Wayne's handwriting, so I can't even look over there. I can't even see Thomas Wolfe in there. So in another life, I've had a long and tempestuous relationship with Thomas Wolfe, even though we haven't lived, as have several people in this room, actually. And the thing I would say about that is that you read Wolfe for the language. That's my belief, right? In other words, you don't read him for the plot, and if so, God help you, because you'll never discover what it is, I don't think. You don't read Wolfe even necessarily for the other things that we think of, as the ingredients of compelling fiction, but you do read Wolfe for the language. There are times in the middle of a paragraph when Thomas Wolfe just takes your breath away. Now you got to read a lot of paragraphs to get to the place where he steals your breath. But if Wayne's right, I accept that nomination. I'll run for that office for that reason, because one of the things I think characterizes mountain writing, good mountain writing, including Wolfe, is that we're not ashamed of the English language. We're not ashamed of the resources that are there. And if we can take you wholeheartedly into the middle of the scene lyrically, we'll do our best to do it. And so I'm blushing almost. I don't know if you can tell at home, but yeah, the thought of being in the room with Thomas Wolfe is pretty powerful.
Well, he's obviously an influence on your stuff. I've read all 4 of your novels now. Some of Wolfe's characters appear in some of your works. There are places, well, the old Kentucky home, just a few blocks away from here is a scene in, I forget one of them. Short time to stay here. And there are also passages that read like Wolfe. So I think we can go ahead and get that nomination started and see what happens with it.
We'll have to all go sit on the porch of the Wolfe Memorial at midnight.
There you go. And as kind of a cognate question with that, I'm a recovering academic. I used to teach literature, and I've read a lot of it, and I've always found pleasing work that is elusive. I think I was taught that allusions are things that belong in poetry more than in prose. But I find a lot of allusions in Terry's work. Some of them are kind of surprising. I saw some reference in one of them to a green shade, and I thought, that's Andrew Marvell. I read that poem 40 years ago.
And you still remember it?
Yeah.
Okay,
That's the scary part.
Yeah.
But there are echoes of Faulkner in there. There's John Donne. You want to talk a little bit about that, Terry?
You know, it's interesting that since you evoked the ghost of Thomas Wolfe, I'll play off of that. Wolfe believed in the collective unconscious, right? He believed in that everything he ever read somehow existed in the depths of his unconscious mind, and that even when he wasn't aware of a turn of phrase, of a metaphor, of an allusion, it somehow surfaced, and that made the writing, let's say it's in My Mistress' Eyes, all kinds of things. It made it deeper, it made it more powerful, it collected the spirit almost, as well as the language from all these works that preceded it. And it collected them by some sort of magical process that such that magic gets transported into the text. I don't know if I believe all that, but I do believe, like Wayne, I'm a recovering academic, as are several people in the audience. We'll have an AA meeting shortly after this concludes. And there's a 12-step process, as you might imagine. And that also means you read for a living in many instances, or at least for 4 or 5 years, you feel like you read for a living when you're in graduate school. And what that means is you bury all that stuff in there. You bury all that poetry. You bury all that, in the case of the previous novel, you bury the King James Bible, which is, as we all know, the only Bible worth reading. And that's for God. And point being that language comes to live inside your imagination. And I would say, Wayne, consciously and subconsciously, right? Sometimes you can hear that echo and you know exactly where it's coming from. Sometimes you can't. Be that as it may, to me, the language has an incantatory power. It has the power to bring you inside a scene. If Wayne is a poet or a novelist, or if I as a novelist do our job well, we can trick you, we can suck you into the narrative so that for a few minutes, this world out here is goes offline, since we're being recorded, and this world in here goes online. And I think language is obviously the tool. That's the tool we have. So yeah, yes to elusive, and yes to Thomas Wolfe. He's 2 for 2. He's getting a big head, you can tell. So.
Okay. Let's get to Mistress. That's after all, that's the occasion of this meeting here. Is it a genre novel?
Yes.
What would you call it?
Yes and no. When I got ready to do this, I had 2 sort of parallel thoughts in mind. One is I wanted to write about xenophobia, why we as human beings are so susceptible to the temptation to hate the other, regardless of who the other is, the person with different eye color, the person of different hair, as if I had any, the person whose skin tone is different, whose body shape is different, and why it's almost so, it's hardwired in a kind of tribal sense inside of us to suspect, to hate, to fear the other. So that was one thing that was floating around in my mind. And I really didn't mean that exploration I didn't want to limit it. Let me say it that way. I didn't want to limit it to current political strife around immigration. I didn't want to limit it to current political strife and toil and trauma around explicit racism in the United States, although all that, of course, is beneath the surface. Was really curious in a larger sense about our species. Why does it act the way it does? So that was one thing. The other thing, and that's a pretty grim thing to spend 4 years, 3 or 4 years thinking about. I'll just go ahead and tell you, hatred is, day after day gets a little stifling, right? The other thing though, and this is, I think where Wayne's going, is this a genre book. I wanted to write a good old fashioned, this is an old fashioned word, hard boiled detective thriller, where the hero comes walking in, with wearing one of those old fashioned 1920s suits and his necktie is askew and so forth. And it's in a tradition, and my sister Julia's here. The book is dedicated in memory of our mother and to Julia. Our father was an addict when it came to these things. He loved them. He consumed them. He lived off of them, I think. And so I talk about this in the acknowledgments. This is one book where you really ought to read the acknowledgments. I promise it's a lot of fun. And the point of that is I wanted to try to do that justice. I wanted to see if I could pull that off. And I really do mean that. I didn't know if I could or not. So it was kind of a challenge. And so this book is intended, in the spirit of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and all that crew. It's intended to be not in any sense is it a parody. It really is in honor of those writers and how well they did that. And so I think it is a genre book. It's shamelessly a genre book, but it also attempts to do that genre in a way that speaks to 21st century readers. So yeah, I own that.
Okay.
Another thing I'll say is I think that you are what you eat in a way, right? I mean, you hear that all the time. Well, I also think you are what you read. And so I read a steady diet of hard-boiled detective fiction for about 2 years. I just didn't let any, if I was judging for a contest or if some friend said, please read my manuscript, yes, I'd read it. But as soon as I got through, I went back to that place on the bookshelf that was, the books had a gun on the cover and, a color and the title. Julia's nodding. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. And dove straight back in. Because I didn't want to, this goes back to the elusiveness again, right? I didn't want to let that language slip away. And for me, that's how I work. If I'm writing something and it is in the not just in the genre, but in the sort of in the spirit of a type of writing, that's what I read, because that's the language I want floating around inside my head. And I don't want anything else in there, right? I don't want anything else to get in the way. So. Yeah.
And I don't think I'm going to be spoiling anything when I say there is a character in here named Ray Chandler.
Mm-hmm.
Rather deliberately.
Oh, yeah. The murderers are named after all those old-fashioned, if you haven't noticed that, go back and look. Ross and Ray. That was deliberate. That was just fun. Sometimes do things just to entertain yourself in the middle of the night. So, yeah.
I think it's a terribly relevant novel to our times. And I think one of the reasons is the questions that we've been raising in this country about critical race theory and all of that stuff that seem to be buzzwords these days. And I think the book speaks directly to that kind of thing. And, Terry, we talked earlier, you want to read a passage that has something to do with that. I want you guys to hear this language.
Thank you. From a poet, that's a high compliment. He didn't lean over and say to me, for God's sake, don't read. Okay, so that's a compliment. This book is narrated by Stephen Robbins, who also narrated A Short Time to Stay Here. This is Stephen 2.0. He gets involved at Ellis Island. If you're a fan of Stephen from Short Time to Stay Here, when that book ends, he's in New York City and he's with Anna Ullman, quite probably the love of his life. But they have a little hiccup in this book, and so they go in different directions. Let's say that for the course of this book, anyway. We'll see what happens to him in the future. And Stephen meets a nurse on Ellis Island named Lucy Paul, and Lucy Paul is the she's the tough guy in this book. She's always taken a big bite out of a stiff drink, and she's always, she's very profane. She loves to talk about sex, you know, and so that was my way around, in part around what is sort of traditionally a kind of paternalistic genre. But at any rate, point is, in this scene, she and Stephen are involved now, and she's just said to him before getting on the ferry to go back to the mainland for the day, that in essence, she says she's a mulatto. Now, this is 1920, the summer of 1920. She walks up the gangplank, gets on the boat, leaves him standing there, not knowing how he'll respond. So in this scene, what happens is that he's thinking about this, and he gets swept into the crowd of immigrants that have just gotten off the ferry and are sort of, without really paying attention, he's swept along up the ramp, up the stairs. And the stairway at Ellis Island, as you'll see in this scene, is where a lot of those initial medical judgments were made about immigrants. So that's what's going on. I let myself go with them, my own disoriented feelings so in tune with theirs that I must be one of them, as far away from home and as anxious to survive as they. I didn't stand out, with my worn, tanned face cracked in half by the jagged scar that ran from my broken nose between my eyes up into my hairline, the missing tooth that showed when I grinned back at life, the pure white patch in my hair at the temple where the scar disappeared, my eyes a tired blue that could look almost reptilian when I was insulted or angry. I imagined I fit right in with my battle scars and anarchist glance. The only difference was that most around me had a number tag tied to a buttonhole, the number of the ship manifest their names had better appear on, and were clutching their identification and travel papers. I had no tag, but I pulled a clutch of notes I'd been writing out of my pants pocket and my Bureau of Investigation badge from inside my jacket. Now I look the part, I remember thinking. Now I can pass up the stairway with them. Then we were on the stairs, mounting slowly up, one step at a time, as the doctors who stood at each landing regarded us each in turn, quickly, efficiently, almost like meat inspectors. The father, who I had reunited with his son in line in front of him, had a weak leg, and he was careful to take each step up with his left foot to hide the lameness in his right. But the doctor on the first landing wasn't fooled for a second. He brought out his piece of chalk and marked the lapel of the man's suit, perhaps his only suit in the world. Who were we, those who stood in line from this one ship? European, certainly. A half dozen vaguely familiar languages were being whispered around me, including a rough Scots burr. And what? Austrian? Italian? Not African, or at least no skin darker than Lucy's. Jewish? Nothing of the pure Nordic strain that the anti-immigration forces seem to think populated the American heartland. Then the son on the landing in front of the first doctor, who glanced up and down at him quickly and nodded him on past. I stepped up and suddenly felt thin and shop-worn before the physician in his uniform. With barely a glance, he brought out his chalk to work on my jacket. I could feel the letter F being scribed against my chest over my heart. The letter F's for face. He paused then, still grasping my lapel, and regarded my face closely, impassively, stared into my eyes ever so briefly, and then the chalk again. I could feel the label X for deranged. Ludmilla Kuchar was right, I thought. It's the psychotic word for me. The doctor nodded, and I stepped up to the next stair. Mulatto. What did the word even mean? That there was a beaker from which an individual life was poured in a stronger, more exotic liquor. That some strong man and some strong woman forgot for a moment that they were supposed to keep to their assigned places in the long line and stepped out at night in the dark. I stepped up to another stair. Did it mean that there was violence in Lucy's past, rape, the flickering, godforsaken scene of a vile white master, an abused slave girl thrown down again and again, or something different, something from a foreign shore where white was less white and black less black? where a woman chose the one she wanted and drew him in. Another stare. Care. In this shabby world, who cared for whom? Who took care? Who cared what you did in the allied darkness when the door was closed and locked and the ocean breeze coursed in through an open window? Where did she come from, Lucy Paul? From what blood? Who had made her this creature that she was, her mind so strong, her fingers curious, that she was sometimes afraid of sleeping alone and sometimes embraced the night? What lineage had produced that throaty laugh? What family had made the curious way she almost dozed while soaking up the sun, and then suddenly said the thing that brought me wholly inside her mind, wholly into the world? Another stare, another landing. Across from me in the line of women and children, a young mother was weeping from the tension, clutching her three children against her skirts as she waited. She had even more letters chalked on her chest than I did. The next stare. Creole, half-breed, mongrel. What did any of these words even mean in the long wash of human striving? I was a mongrel if there ever was such a thing. Scots, Irish, Welsh, German. Once heard my uncle curse his son for messing with a high yaller gal. Stupid bastard, I said aloud to Uncle Foster as I stood there on the stairs at Ellis Island, growled at him across 30 years, 1,000 miles. People in line turned to look at me, alarmed by the tone of my voice, even if they didn't understand the words. Another stare, and another. Then we were at the top. Our line moving slightly faster now as it was divided up into the several long chutes made of wooden benches leading to the examiner's station. But first, the eye test. Each man, woman, and child in turn, at first one, and then the other eyelid turned inside out with a button hook as they stood in line. As the doctor searched for any sign of the dreaded trachoma. I was still in line, still thinking about Foster Robbins and his fury over his son's dalliance with a maid at the mountain park. When I stepped up to the eye doctor, he reached for my face and I exploded. Keep your hands off me, you son of a bitch. Sorry about that last line. I thought about as I was reading, I thought maybe I could edit that at the last possible minute, but it wouldn't sound the same.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't. I don't know if you know David Joy's work, but David's use of language is sometimes like that.
Salty.
Salty, I'd
Yeah.
say. And I asked him one night, I said, how do you read this stuff in public? And he said, well, I just take a highlighter and I highlight the words that I'll leave out if there are kids in the audience. It would be a short reading.
That's
but,
right. It'd be like the, and, but, or, yeah.
Which is not to disparage David's work at all. I like it very much, but it's just okay. I'm reminded hearing this passage of a friend of mine that I knew a long time ago. His name was Harry Chipper's, and he was Greek. And he came through Ellis Island in 1900. And he was Aristoteles. It became Harry.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some other Greek word that was his last name, but it became Chipper's. And he had a buttonhole tag,
Mm-hmm.
which said he was supposed to go to Asheville.
Mm-hmm.
They sent him to Bowling Green, Kentucky instead.
Yeah.
He went to California and then finally got back to Asheville 3 years later, where a cousin was going to put him in, the restaurant business or whatever. Anyway, Harry told me a story that I've remembered a long time. He said, when I first got to Asheville, people would look at me and they'd say, hey, foreigner, what are you doing? And he said, foreigner? What are we talking about? He came Sunday. I came Wednesday. That's the only difference. And I just like to remember Harry on that, and simply to say that what Terry has put together here from my very limited understanding is a very realistic picture of what happened at Ellis Island. And these are people that I know about who got in.
Right.
And then we've got the people who were rejected. And some of their stories are in here too. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. I've heard tell that writers are frustrated preachers. Or preachers are frustrated writers.
That's what it is. Thank you. I vote for the second, but anyway.
And I remember particularly in the Speakeasy book that there's a lot of sermonizing going on around in there. And there's a prayer meeting in Mistress eyes that I think is well worth paying attention to. If any of you have never been to a Hardshell Baptist prayer meeting, you'll find something in here to enlighten yourself. Jerry, would you like to talk about Jesus in the book?
Jesus. Yeah. There's a character in whatever that other book's name is, the Holy Ghost Speakeasy Revival. I'm looking at that and she'll give me a clue if I can't remember the title of my own book. And this character is named Jesus, the Son of God Smith, and which I just took great delight in writing as a character. And he's a very black man, and he's a very wise man also. And so a lot of times I am at least toying with this idea of Jesus in the real world. I'm looking at you guys. I say this. You and I have talked a little bit about this. Not long ago and far away, wearing sandals and a bed sheet, striding across the burning sands to Ephesus or someplace, But right here, right now, Jesus on the streets in Asheville. And so again, a lot of this stuff sort of works itself out in this book. I think the thing that's in common there is love of language, right? There's a scene in that other book, Speakeasy, Holy Ghost Speakeasy and Revival, where H.L. Mencken, and a created, imagined H.L. Mencken in my mind, is talking to Jedediah Robbins, who's the protagonist of the book. And Robbins tells Mencken, we're both word cursed. We do what we do to shut up the voices inside our heads. We write or we preach or we do what we do to silence that incessant flow of language. And I think I wrote it, and in this case, I meant it. I don't always mean everything I write, but in that case, sometimes just for fun. But in that case, I really did mean it. I suppose you could say it's true of Wayne, it's true of me, it's true of several of you in the audience. And I think the prayer meeting in this novel has a sort of, nefarious purpose, because the murderers are using the lure of religion to gather a gang. In fact, the gang is called, they call themselves the Congregation. And they're the ones who are murdering those immigrants that they don't believe should be allowed into the country, because they believe they will somehow corrupt the pure Nordic strain. And in the 1920s, the word Nordic was very popular. The pure Nordic strain of American manhood and womanhood, which of course never existed. But the reason that was intriguing to me and interesting to me is because I think that the two things that are most likely to seduce any of us, and I'm waving to you at home, word of warning, waving to the people in the room, that would seduce any of us to nefarious doings are either A, sex, or B, religion. Those are our two. If you want to go out in the street and start a movement to burn down the town, those are the two things. You can, in politics, there's some line, I know that Wendy and Lynn know this line. What is it? Everything is about sex except sex. No, everything. What is that line from House of Cards? Anyway, everything's about sex except money or something like that. And money's power. Yeah. And so what was interesting to me about that is how those, and again, obviously in either case, these strong human drives that drive involving sexuality, the need for community, the need for a spiritual connection to something greater than ourselves, are being corrupted. Don't get me wrong. This is not a critique of those things so much as it is, again, it's a description of who we are as human beings. So that's our weakness. That's the way we can be had, if that makes sense. So at any rate, there is a prayer meeting. And I can remember asking Mary Caldwell this question. I don't know if you remember this, Mary, about I need a Bible verse that's about purity versus corruption. And I just assumed Mary would like whip out, right? She's a preacher. 3 or 4 verses off the top of her head. She failed miserably to do so. I think she doesn't know nearly enough about corruption. And so I found the passage where, if thy eye offends thee, pluck it out. If thy hand offends thee, chop it off. Well, you can obviously you can decide for yourself whether that's literal or figurative or metaphorical. But that's the passage under discussion in this prayer meeting. And again, the way I use it, the way I have them, the bad guys and gals use it, is that their point is that in their mind, America exists in this pure state. And if it's to be corrupted by those who come across the borders now, right, then how can we protect it? And so if this evil corrupting force offends thee, cut it out, chop it off. I don't know, you have to decide for yourself, if that works or not in your imagination. Yeah, okay. There's a prayer meeting in the center. I thought about reading it because I knew Wayne liked that scene. I thought about reading the prayer meeting, but it's a different animal. So.
It is that. It is that. And for those of you who haven't read it, that might have given away a little bit too much. So
that's all right.
Whatever.
They swore when they came in they would read it. That's part of the deal. So anyway. Yeah.
No. Okay. I'm going to ask this question just because there may be some people in our audience who are thinking about writing something themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a question that I've wrestled with in the past along this. And maybe I'll just start with an observation. You are not afraid to put people like H.L. Mencken in your novels, historical people. People who actually existed, people who can fact check about, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Is there a point where you said something about how you imagined Mencken? Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, there are 2 historical characters who appear in this book. One is sort of off stage, and that's Billy Sunday. I all but plagiarize a wonderful Billy Sunday sermon and give it. Oh, that's in the last book, Jedediah Robinson. But also in the last book was H.L. Mencken. I wanted somebody, because my hero was a con man. He's a preacher and a bootlegger and essentially a con man. He's a traveling evangelist bootlegger who at best is an agnostic. Lynn and I argue about whether he's an atheist or an agnostic. She says he has faith. I think that means she has faith. That's what that means. But at any rate, he does. As it turns out, I think probably he does. But so he steals. He doesn't steal it. I steal it for him. This Billy Sunday sermon, which was just too good to pass up. Again, because of the language. It's that's the tool. If you're building a house, you got a hammer and a saw. If you're building a book, what do you got? You got words, right? So once you've created this character who's a fraud for all intents and purposes, you got to have somebody to reveal him, to show him to the world for who he is, and who better than H.L. Mencken, who, spent his entire life doing that kind of thing. And so Mencken comes south, in my imagination, to skewer him on the pen of his self-righteousness, Mencken says. And they meet and they discover they're very much alike. But again, the beauty of that, in that book, there's an interlude between two parts in the novel where I got to write H.L. Mencken for like 3 or 4 pages. And that's nothing but fat fun. I'm just telling you, because Mencken was this outrageous stylist, pure bunk, pure boulder dash, to use the lingo. And so you get to steal that, you get to mimic it for 3 or 4 pages, and that was fun. There are historical characters in all these novels, some of whom are well known, like Mencken or a Billy Sunday or somebody like that. A lot of them are not. There are historical characters in all the books, including this one. Augustus Sherman is in this book, and he's a historical character, the photographer. But these books are full of photographers and photography. I think it's because I'm very visual, and for me, if I can see a picture, that spins me off into all kinds of imagined scenes better than language. So these Sherman photographs are real. It tells you about them in acknowledgement. You can order that book on Amazon. It's out of print, so you can't get it at Malaprops. But the photographs are just astonishing. But they all have to do with what essentially I believe I assigned to them, which is studies in what we would call race and ethnicity. And not just, in America, I think we sometimes get bogged down in the notion of black and white, and that's race. Well, that's not in the history of humanity. That's not really, that's an American problem in particular, but it's not a historical problem past 200 years ago, and it's not since the 1600s. I shouldn't just say 200. But anyway, point is, these are images of people that are essentially quasi-scientific studies of who they are because of their genetics, their DNA. And that's really at the heart of this book, to be honest. It's, the judgments we make about people at first glance, largely subconsciously, I would say, right? We glance at somebody and make all sorts of assumptions as tumblers start falling inside our brains, largely subconsciously, until we reach the point where it surfaces and we can say something about it. So that's a long way from the question, but Augustus Sherman is a historical character. As far as I know, he does not have descendants. I'm not in danger of being sued. Knock on wood.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, why did Stephen Robbins come back? Did you think you were done with him at the end of Short Time?
Yeah. I knew that I wanted to write about xenophobia. Xenophobia is a fancy word, again, for why we hate the other or suspect the other. And I knew, and I wanted to use Ellis Island because Ellis Island was a closed system. Now, again, it's, to me, I'm always thinking about setting. It's just, I like this setting where it's an island. Now, granted, thousands of immigrants are flowing through it like the tide in the harbor in New York City, but there's a cast of characters who are there. They don't get on a bus and go away. They don't go answer a cell phone call and disappear for 100 pages. They're there. They're on stage. And so I knew I wanted Ellis Island. I knew I wanted that. I knew it was a murder mystery because, you'd like people to actually read the book. That's another way of saying giving it a plot that moves along at a pretty good clip. So I knew all of that, but I honestly didn't know who the detective was. But I found out that the 1920s were the time period I wanted, because that was the heyday of eugenics in America, right? And American sociologists were writing about eugenics in a way that directly fed Adolf Hitler and the rise of Nazism in the 30s in Germany. I mean, Hitler was reading Americans and saying, oh, that's the idea I want. And so that I had all that. I knew all those ingredients, and I needed a quote detective, unquote. Well, Stephen was handy. He was in New York. I knew his voice. I knew a lot about the inside of his head. I knew a lot about the inside of his emotions. I also knew that even though he had this sort of tough exterior, that he had what he calls a ragged heart early in this book, which is to say He's a romantic, which is to say, in this world, he will suffer, right? The world will make you pay for a ragged heart. So Anna steps off stage. Lynn and I still debate that, which is a nice way of saying we argue about it. And he's contacted by the nameless man to go to Ellis Island at a point in his life when he says he's at the end of his rope and the rope is slippery with sweat. There's no knot at the end of this rope, right? And so he goes there in a state of mind that's tough enough for what's required of him. And he sort of appeared. I mean, I've written about this a little bit in websites that talk about crime novels. He volunteered in a way. And I wasn't sure. I didn't buy it. This is going to sound strange because it sounds like I was talking to Stephen Robbins in my head, and I was. And he said, yeah, and he said, I'm here. And I said, no. And he said, oh, yeah. So there's a scene, and if you're under 21 years old, you're going to need to cover your ears for this, what I'm about to tell you. There's a scene late in the book where he's talking to the nameless man who eventually becomes Jack Duran. We find out his name in this book. And Duran works for the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI. And he says, I should pull you out of here. You're not trained for this. And this is the profane part. And Stephen says, well, maybe I'm just a goddamn natural. And he is. That's the interesting thing. When he showed up and raised his hand and said, I'm your man, it turns out he does have those characteristics. He is stubborn. He sees inside people's heads. He knows what they're thinking. He knows how to ask the right kinds of questions. He knows how to move through a landscape in a way that, the rest of us really don't. The rest of us don't see everything Stephen says. He's a watcher. So he volunteered, in essence, at some point. And he is a natural.
Well, that makes perfect sense to me. I have heard some of my characters talking to me, and they still do on occasion. And that sounds a little like mental illness. Maybe it is, but it's just the way that this stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand him volunteering. I like the way you put that. I think we may have some questions from the audience. I'm just going to ask one more short one, which is what's next.
Mm. So we know what's next. What's next is a book that's set in Asheville, and it hinges on November the 20th, 1930, when the banks crashed, when Central B&T didn't open its doors. And that was the day that Asheville fell. It crumbled. Life stopped in this little mountain town. It wasn't in October 29 when the stock market crash in New York occurred. It happened on November the 20th, 1930. It is narrated from the first page to the last page by a woman. It's a woman's voice. It's the first time I've ever tried that. You'll have to, Lynn has read it, and Wendy has read it. You'll have to ask them if it works. It is, Turner has optioned it. It's going to appear next July, a little less than a year, 11 months from now. And the title, as of this morning, all hands have agreed, is the Sky Club. Because in addition to the bank, the Sky Club up on Bowcatcher Mountain plays an imaginary, because it wasn't a nightclub in 1930. That didn't happen until later, but that the bank and the club are the two sort of, in the balance pan on each side of this. One is all jazz. It's the truth. It's nighttime truth, and the other is all numbers, and it's daytime truth. And these two things sort of swing against each other through the book. So thank you.
Looking forward to that.
I think it's right. All right, questions from the masked ones. Yes, sir, Jim.
Got a couple. One, what is Robin's relationship with alcohol in this book? book.
Mhm.
And the second is you mentioned that in preparing for this book or writing this book, you were also reading detective novels. And other authors might do the reverse. You know, they might be scared about maybe inadvertently picking up a phrase or a plot line. So how confident are you in what you've already, you know, envisioned this book as, or any book
Yeah.
that you write?
Well, so Robin's relationship to alcohol, Stephen is either a high functioning alcoholic or, and again, this is something Lynn and I, you should hear their debates at our supper table, but Lynn and I debate about Stephen and alcohol. He sobers up in a short time stay here by and large. The Stephen in this book drinks, but not, I would say, to excess. One man's excess is another man's, you know, I don't know, train wreck, I suppose. But no, he doesn't drink that much. He does drink. But again, it's almost goes without saying that these kinds of, you know, these detectives, you know, once he showed up and volunteered, that the alcohol's a part of it. And by the way, they write, in those old detective novels I was talking about reading, they write about alcohol just in a gorgeous way. Now, again, I don't say alcohol's gorgeous. Don't put that on me. I'm just saying the way they write about it, it's fascinating. I'm not worried. The influence doesn't scare me because I knew a lot about what I wanted this book to be about and how I wanted it to unfold. So I wasn't afraid that the plot would somehow get pushed off the rail, Jim. It was more that I was really interested in the language and the tone and the mood in these books, which are, you know, even to this day, come along about November when the weather gets cold and we all go inside, you know, go to the library and get 5 or 6, you know, Dashiell Hammett's and Ross McDonald's, et cetera, and just curl up and, you know, pour yourself a glass of milk and read. Somebody else. Throw a question in. I know there are questions out there. Burbling. There are questions burbling out there. Would you like to know? And if I tell a lie, Lynn will straighten it out. Or my sister will, Julie. Yes, Wendy, I think that's you behind that mask.
So all of your other books so far have been set in the mountains. And it sounds like, well, I know that your next one is also set right here. I wonder how comfortable were you in New York City?
I'll tell you a funny story about that. In this very store over there where Stephanie was standing, I was talking to Fred Chappell the last time he and Susan were here and read something. And he said, "So what are you working on?" I said, "I'm working on a book set on Ellis Island." And he said, "Well, you've got more guts than I do." And that was Fred's way of saying you're out of your mind, basically. The comfort level for me had to do with Ellis Island. I would no more have attempted to write a book set in Manhattan or Brooklyn in 1920 than I would jump off the top of this building. That's just too much, right? It's too much culture, too much territory, too much everything. It's just too much, right? But I convinced myself that Ellis Island wasn't too big. Now it's big in terms of the whole immigration theme, right? And action. It's a lot of people moving across stage, at least the way I imagine it in this book, right behind the characters. But that didn't scare me, but the city would have been terrifying. Stephen goes at one point to a tenement when he's looking for the woman who's disappeared at the beginning of the book, Karen McManaway. And so there's that one scene, and then there's a couple of other scenes in New York, but that's it. The rest of the time they're on the island. And so I convinced myself I could get away with that, essentially. So I was this comfortable.
We don't have any questions from the home audience at this point, so I will make another ask if any of y'all have questions to go ahead before we wrap up.
You've done your research. You said a number of people were rejected at Ellis Island.
roughly what percentage got sent back?
It wasn't that high. It was maybe, depending, maybe 20. And most of it was medical. But they made some shocking judgments about people's intelligence and about people's what we would call psychological health. There's a scene in here where Lucy Paul gives Stephen one of the tests. It's a puzzle that, and you can look at this puzzle online, that they had designed to test the relative intelligence of immigrants because it was language neutral. Didn't matter what your native language was, you could take this test, they thought. And Stephen, of course, fails it miserably, and would have been decoded as an imbecile. That was the word in the 1920s they would have used, and been sent back, quite probably. And so part from the get-go, one of the things I wanted to deal with in this book was neither Stephen nor Lucy would have been allowed through in all probability. So the two people, who are at the center of the story, who are essentially there to try to solve this problem, neither of them would have been allowed in the country, quite likely. And so the irony there is quite pointed. And to me, that was one of the things, having him live in the psychotic unit, the psycho ward, essentially, was very intentional on my part. That's where he goes. That's who he is. That's who, and so to me, that's one of the most interesting things about Ellis. They did it gorgeous. I mean, the hospital there was state of the art. They healed people of all different kinds of diseases, keeping in mind, not just American diseases, but diseases from all over the world, before they actually allowed them to go on shore. And the people they sent back, you have to reach your own judgment about the judgments they were making. There's a list in here. I think it was 1918. The Immigration Act of 1917. Here's who is, now I want everybody in here to see which of these apply to you. We will not allow alcoholics, anarchists, contract laborers, criminals, convicts, epileptics, feeble-minded, idiots, illiterates, imbeciles, insane persons, paupers, persons afflicted with contagious diseases, persons being mentally or physically defective, persons with constitutional psychopathic inferiority. I think that was just about all of it. Political radicals, polygamists, prostitutes, or vagrants. You couldn't get in if you were a polygamist. Where'd that come from? I mean, I don't know if they were afraid they were going to be overrun with polygamists. So that's the Immigration Act of 1917. And of course, that was in effect. And basically in that chapter, Stephen says, well, I hit about 6 of those.
So if one person in the family hit one of those, did the whole family get sent back?
No.
Oh.
And so you might be, I mean, the history of Ellis Island is full of these things where it's you and grandma and your husband and your 3 kids, and your husband, for what it has, trachoma. They can try to heal him of that by putting acid in his eyes. So, and they probably get sent back. So right there on the island, everybody says their goodbyes. And those families were so intensely desirous of getting in that that's part of the hand you were dealt. You were always at risk of that. And of course the laws were changing constantly. It was very hard to predict. And again, you didn't walk up to this border. You were on a ship for weeks, probably in steerage. And you landed half starved, not having bathed in days and days, and not speaking English. But all that, so it was terrifying. But all that said, in many ways, I think Ellis Island was a truly humane institution. But that's, having made that statement, I will also say the judgments they made, particularly about people's physical health, physical appearance, their mental or emotional state. How do you judge someone's emotional state if you don't speak their language? Well, they would look at you, and if you look deranged, like Stephen, it's the psychotic ward for you. So that scene that I read, you know, where he's going up the stairs, and they took out chalk and they marked on your lapel, you know, if you limped, L for leg, you know, if you were bent over, B for back, if you were pregnant, PG for pregnant, if you were, you know, so they just marked you like a piece of luggage, you know, and so when you got to the top of the stairs and then, you know, and you could appeal, there was an appeals process and so forth, but again, they were very clear about the fact that we only want people we can use economically, socially, you know, and is that fair? You know, we'll vote on it, you know, whether that's fair or not. But it was, you know, it wasn't give us your poor, you're tired, you're restless, yearning to be free. It was about, you know, at any point in history, in the history of Ellis Island, it was about who we want, who we can use. So we, in our view, American society needs. And for much of the history, they needed laborers.
Who paid to send them back?
The steamship company. The steamship company was supposed to have sorted and sifted these people before they ever let them on. Well, of course, if they showed up cash in hand, the steamship company was normally happy to let them on, right? But the steamship company was contractually responsible for taking back the people who were rejected.
Because they wouldn't have had the money.
No.
They would have been too poor.
Well, and if you were going ashore, but Wayne was getting shipped back, he's going to give you all the money.
Yeah.
Because you're going to need it.
But I'm a pauper, so I can't give her any money. But
Yeah.
I get them back.
She didn't know that when she married you. But anyway, no. But yeah, that. So any baby, oh, by the way, any baby born on Ellis Island is not a citizen of the United States. By law, they're a citizen of whatever country the mother came from. So even though they were born inside the boundaries of the United States, the idea was, of course, that because they believed that mothers would come there with the intent of giving birth in the United States, so their babies would automatically become citizens. And so if you showed up and you were pregnant, they kept you there in the hospital to give birth, but your child was not granted citizenship. Now, you may be allowed to land with your child, but your child wouldn't be a citizen. So they had all these very interesting, once you take the lid off one of these historical topics and you look inside that Pandora's box, you begin to see all these very intricate, I don't know, codes. There are lots of codes, right, that are at work inside these worlds that govern what people can and can't do.
Thank you.
No, it's that time. It's the bewitching hour.